All right, looks like we have a few people that are looking to get some good info the night before the AP Lit exam, and I am grateful to be here. Please toss your names and well, at least where you're from in the chat. We'd love to give you a shout out. Rhode Island, New Jersey. New Jersey. The Devils made it all the way through round one. Unfortunately, the Bruins did not. That is super sad for me, but that's okay. So anyway, I am here and I hope that everybody is quite well. And we're going to get Brian on here pretty soon. And we'll be able to start fielding questions and whatnot. We got Indiana, Trinidad. Oh, that's excellent. Florida, Texas, Arizona. Brian, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Tim.
Okay, I can't see you though. So we're going to click to start the video on that. And there we go.
How we doing? Can you see me now?
We got you. We got you. You'll be up on the video pretty soon. And you should be able to see that. We got the comments coming in. Let's see.
We got people from all over the place. Jupiter, Florida, New Jersey, Kentucky.
Philadelphia, Colorado, Minnesota. This is great. Fort Worth. All right. And hey, do you have one of yours in here as well?
Did you see that?
Look at it. It says New York and it says Mr. Stabnick right there. Brooke McCormick. Is that someone?
What's up, Brooke?
All right. Awesome. So nonetheless, folks, I really appreciate that you are here. I'm Tim Freitas. I work with the Garden of English. This is my friend Brian. Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about you before we get into things, and I'll talk about how we're going to break down our hour together, and then we'll send people off to Marco Learning if they want to cram some more.
All right, so I'm Brian Stabnick. I teach at Miller Place High School, which is in New York. I've taught AP Lit for 15 years, maybe a little bit more because I've stopped keeping track. And I've done some things over the years, like I've worked on the test development committee. I've been an AP reader. So I've helped develop the exam. I've helped score the exam, and I'm still teaching it every day in the classroom.
Awesome. Now, do you teach Lang too, or are you just a Lit guy?
I taught AP seminar last year, but
Gotcha.
I've always been a Lit guy and only a Lit guy.
All right. Sounds good. And did you like seminar, by the way? I have dreams of teaching seminar.
It was one of those classes that you like are baptism by fire. So I didn't know exactly what I was doing. And I took a summer workshop, but the more I taught the class, the more I loved it because you have a lot of freedom. And there's also a lot of like student autonomy. They can go in different directions. So that made it cool.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, here's what we're going to do for tonight, folks. We are going to go through, Brian and I are going to talk about our best strategies that we have for every part of the AP exam. So what that means with the AP Wit exam that you'll be taking tomorrow. So we'll start with multiple choice. If you've got questions about multiple choice stuff, you could toss them in the chat. I can't promise that we're going to catch everyone because the chat is lighting up here. But we're going to try to answer as many questions in the chat as we can. And we'll try to catch them. And while I'm answering, I'll be looking in the chat while Brian's answering. When I'm answering, Brian will be looking at the chat. When Brian's answering, I'll be looking at the chat. We'll try to hook you up. So we're going to go for multiple choice. Then we'll talk about question 1 with poetry. Then we'll talk about question 2 with prose. Then we'll finish with the open-ended question, literary argument, question 3. And for those of you that are interested in cramming even more, Marco Learning is doing a session at 8 o'clock Eastern time on their channel. And that's actually linked in the description right down below this video. So you can actually head right over there as well. And I've actually seen, and I might say this wrong, but I've seen Mrs. Zakruski show up a bunch. Like I've seen that scroll like 5 times past my eyes. So Mrs. Zakruski, I don't know who you are or if I even said that correctly, but your students clearly love you. So shout out to you there. And I'll shout out to Mrs. Gilbert too. I just saw that right there as well. So anyway, Brian, let's actually start this off. I want to know, in your classroom, what is the biggest struggle for your kids when they deal with multiple choice on exam day? Give me some of those struggles and then we'll talk about how to alleviate those things.
All right, I think for my students, one struggle is vocabulary. So with those question stems, so the multiple choice, the multiple choice portion of it, if there's a word that they don't understand, I think some kids just give up in frustration. So that's a big one. Even if they can cut it down to 2 or 3 and they're not sure. So I think that's a major frustration, is not knowing the words and what they mean.
Now, are you talking about words in the answers themselves, or are you talking about words in the actual passages?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think more the dread is in the answers themselves, because when I always talk about passages, I often talk about footholds, like start with the lowest thing that you know, the most basic thing, and try to climb your way up from there. So I think especially with poetry that some students, get thrown off by, if you find your footholds early and find the 2 or 3 things that you know, often that can help you unlock other things. So I think there's always that way to overcome it within a passage. I'm talking specifically about the answers, and that's where
Okay.
the greatest frustration leads to.
Okay, so let's actually talk about vocab and passages first. Like, do you have anything that we could do if we're reading a passage and we get a word that we don't know? Let's say it's some pre-20th century poetry, or even just poetry in general, or it's kind of a harder reading, a little bit more cumbersome. Do you have any vocab tips for just the reading itself? I'll give mine, and then I'll talk about how we deal with vocab and the answers. Then we'll take some of the questions from the chat that's up here.
Yeah, I always like my students to start from a position of confidence. And so the strategy that I talk about occasionally is the one of finding your footholds. And
Yes.
I think if you realize how much you actually know and focus on that versus getting caught up in what you don't know, you're going to realize if you understand 75 to 80% of the passage, most likely you're going to be able to answer 75, 80, maybe 90% of the questions.
Yes.
So I want them not to get focused on what they don't know, or not to get caught up in that, but really to get focused on what they do know.
Absolutely. And that's a huge confidence builder. I tell my kids the exact same thing. And just before I make another comment about that, I want to point out that Mrs. Zakruski and I are actually best friends. So for all of Zakruski's students, like you gotta know, like we're tight. All right. So anyway, Brian, I just got a text from Mrs. Zakruski, and I just had to make sure I played that up. So anyway, nonetheless, one of the things that I tell my kids to do to work with what they do know, even if they really want to work with, like, they're like, I just want to figure this word out, is part of what I do with my students is I say, look, if you find a word, you most likely have context clues that can get you to define that word. So draw arrows to it. Circle the word you don't know and just draw arrows. But if you absolutely can't figure out what the word means, at least try to guess its connotation. Is it positive or is it negative? Because if it's positive or negative, and you'll most likely be able to figure that out based on the context, that'll at least let you just move on and know the idea here is supposed to be negative or the idea here is supposed to be positive. And then when it comes to the multiple choice answer, if you're in with those lines, look at the answers that have positive connotations or negative connotations. And if the word itself had a positive connotation, you can then eliminate those kind of negative answers there. But let's actually talk about what that looks like with these words that we don't know in the answers. What happens there with your students?
So I think often it's a matter of them wanting to spend too much time trying to figure out that one thing. And I think that's when the anxiety starts to increase. But just like you said, I'm a big fan of just getting a general feel for not only the passage, but the choices themselves. Often with the choices, you'll see a distractor, which means it's close to being right, but there's ultimately something that makes it wrong. And recognizing that, especially when you're down to maybe 2, maybe 3 choices, is looking for the one that's the distractor, because the correct answer is going to be wholly 100% correct. It's not like there's ever going to be a question where both answers are right and one is the better answer. The distractor is going to have something essentially wrong with it. And looking for that and knowing that, I think it's a great strategy for the multiple choice.
Now, having written a lot of multiple choices in your day, Brian, were there different things that you did while you were writing your multiple choice to kind of create those lead distractors? Because I'll go through my process in a moment that I've also picked up in terms of patterns on the WIT exam and the Lang exam as well. But I want to just hear from the man himself. Was there anything that you personally did when you were like thinking about, hey, writing these wrong answers that you were like, hey, this is how this works?
So I'll say this, as a teacher, I think writing multiple choice questions is the hardest part of test development.
Yeah.
And luckily on the committee, we didn't write the multiple choice questions themselves. So we found the passages, and then College Board and ETS, which also runs the SAT and AP, like test development, they freelanced that out to other people. But we took all of the tests and gave feedback on the questions. Those questions were then tested on the college level to see if they met the metrics that College Board was looking for. But writing multiple choice, I think, is challenging because you want to have those good distractors. And I think that is so essential, is recognizing that.
How do you write a wrong answer that sounds right? You know what I mean? That is the hardest part. Now, one of the things that I've noticed for patterns, and you've been doing this for a long time too, so you can either confirm or deny. And I said either confirm or deny. Is this. I've noticed that a lot of times the lead distractor, if my kids can narrow it down to 2, the lead distractor typically has something in the answer that is correct and something that's incorrect. That's one of the parts. Where my students don't then stick with what they know, they actually question how they missed the incorrect part. So they're distracted and they're like, oh, my comprehension was bad. And that goes back to your first bit of advice. That's, hey, approach with confidence. If you've got 2 answers and there's one answer that you know that you might have, that you think there might be a wrong part, and you question your reading judgment, that's probably the lead distractor. So one of them is it's half right, it's half wrong. Another lead distractor that I've noticed in terms of patterns, this is just anecdotal evidence, is that there are times when the correct answer, like the answer is actually correct, but not for that particular question. So I'm like, I know I read that, but you didn't read it in response to that particular question stem that's actually being asked. And the last one that I've seen a bit is that it's an incredibly vague version of the correct answer. So it's to the point where it's like, that's so all encompassing that it can't be the precise and best answer for the piece. So I always encourage my kids to go into their multiple choice, knowing that those are the common anecdotal characteristics of lead distractors. And typically they can then narrow it down to 2 and then say, all right, is there something that seems to be wrong? Is it definitely right, but not for this question? Or is this a really vague answer? And therefore this one is actually significantly better. And that one's practically wrong because it's so vague. How do you feel about that, Brian?
I'll add 2 things to that. I also coach basketball, and one of the quotes you hear often in basketball is be fast, but don't rush. So you want to play the game quick, but you don't want to rush it because that's when it leads to mistakes.
Yeah.
In working on the test development committee, I know I made mistakes in answering questions because I got caught up when I gravitated to something that seemed right, but I didn't read the full answer. So just like you talked about, where something may be half right, but the other half of that answer stem is wrong, my eye gravitated to the right part. I put it down on my booklet, moved on to the next question, and didn't read the whole entire stem. And I think that's where the be fast, because you have 55 questions in 1 hour. That's no joke, but you can't rush. So just having that poise and that confidence of, I'm going to read through all the choices, I'm going to make my best decision, I think is invaluable. Another thing, we'll kind of piggyback on what you said, is wording of questions is really important, because it may say in line 19. It may say in context of the stanza or in the context of the paragraph. Those are key words because in line 19 is talking specifically about that line, whereas in context, you need to get a feel for the entire stanza, the entire paragraph. And that's where having the context often leads to understanding tone, maybe understanding a thematic shift or a tonal shift. It may look at a juxtaposition that happened earlier in the paragraph that changes later on in the paragraph. So recognizing the language of questions, I think, is essential.
That's actually excellent advice, because that can actually help us pinpoint where to find the answer in and of itself. I always tell my students that you can know if you have a right answer because you can give it the finger, this one right here, and you can just point to the text where it actually shows up. And so because of that, having that, really focusing on that language of in context or in line, if if I'm saying in context stanza 2 blahs, then you have to actually think about stanza 2's placement after stanza 1, but before stanza 3. But if I've got in line 19, chances are I can work with just, line 19 and the line before it and the line after to work that out. That's some nuance that I think could really help a lot. As I look at the questions that are in here, I do want to give a shout out to Ms. Rivera and Ms. Riedling. Kids are going, kids are dropping those names in there. But one question about multiple choice from a student here is, how do you recommend pacing yourself during the MCQs? What do you tell your kids when they're like, what do I do to pace? Like, is there any set way that you kind of encourage your kids to approach the test that way?
So we've done a lot of practice. I think at this point we have done 3 full-length exams over the course of the year. And by the year, I start something that a lot of teachers do. We do multiple choice Monday.
Oh yeah, I do that.
Starting in late February, I think it is, I give them one passage from an AP exam and the 9 to 12 questions that go along with it.
Yep.
Based on those number of questions, that's how many minutes they have to answer that multiple choice Monday. So if there's 9 questions that week, they have 9 minutes to answer. If there's 12 minutes. We do that every Monday, and that's how we get 3 full-length exams completed by this time of the year. And I think they learn that pace. And so earlier in the year, so like late January, early February, they're rushing to finish by that 9-minute mark. So when my timer goes off on my phone, some kids are still working. The more we do that, the more you get familiar with the language of the questions, the types of questions they're asking on multiple choice. I think the more comfortable you get. But I'll go back to a story from my first year teaching AP. I had a student that was extremely bright. I thought for sure he was going to get a 5 on the test. He was also a slow but brilliant thinker. Like, he needed to chew on his ideas. He needed to digest a passage. He ended up getting a 3 because if there were maybe 20 more minutes on that exam, I think he clearly would have gotten a 5. I think this is a test that rewards rapid thinking. Yeah. But that whole advice of being fast but not rushing is really important.
Yeah. And I actually have had students like that too. And I think that's the one fallback of this test. I do think this test does deal well with literary skills, but the time factor does not always associate well with some of my most brilliant kids. And that's just this part of life. And in college, you have timed exams, and it's just part of what happens. I can think of a million times in college when the professor was like, "You've got 3 hours for your exam. You either finish it or you don't," and then that was it. All right, so another question here. Oh, let me just talk one thing about pacing. As if you really need a pacing plan going in tomorrow, I'm going to just suggest that you try to say, you've got 55 questions, but you also have to read passages. So you're really thinking about spending, at most 45 seconds per question. Okay. But you should be able to go in and read the question and say, okay, how can I approach this and get my answer? But one of the time wasters for questions, folks, are the accept questions. Those are legitimate time wasters. If you are at a question that says all of these things except, then, and you know that you're going to be pressed for time, please, by all means, just skip that one question, because by skipping that one question, you might be able to answer 3 more, because you're not going through every single answer and rechecking that back in the piece. And you're not going to get tons of questions that have the word except in it. I think at most you'll probably see between 5 and 10. So that's just something about pacing there. Brian, do you have anything to add to that before I move on?
I mean, you're going to see a breakdown of 3-2 on the exam for multiple choice. There will either be 3 poems, 2 prose passages, or 2 poems, 3 prose passages. And just like you said, if you're working and reading time and time flies when you're on a high stakes test, and sometimes you get caught up on a question, I think when you're spending too much time and you're worrying about it. So there's always the chance to come back, but this is a test that only rewards correct answers.
Yeah.
It's not like the old SAT or even the way the AP test was 10, 15 years ago, where if you left it blank, you would get partial credit. That is gone. So it is only right answers. So spending a lot of time on one question is definitely a terrible strategy. So if you feel like you're doing that, just move on. And if you have time at the end, you can always come back.
Right. And on top of that, too, if you don't have time at the end and you've got 10 questions left, folks, choose one letter and just bubble it straight down. Don't even random bubble. Choose one letter and bubble it down to finish your time. Now, one of the questions that I do get a lot from students, it's showing up right here in the chat. And folks, you have to forgive me. I'm a little bit behind in the chat because I'm trying to address the questions as I see them. But also shout out to the school in Trinidad who shout out to their English teacher. I do apologize. I'm not going to try to pronounce the last name just because I don't want to botch it, because I don't think that's right. But shout out to those of you in Trinidad. Brian, the question here is, how can you successfully read essentially hard readings on the AP Lit exam and comprehend them? Like, do you have any quick strategies about reading comprehension to help really glean, things? The test is tomorrow, let's be real. So practice reading doesn't really help right now. Any quick things where you're like, these are just good tips to kind of help you read and figure out what's going on, especially for a harder text?
All right. So for me, this is a tip that has never worked for me. I've never been a person to read the questions first, find the line numbers, mark them, then read the passage, then go back to the questions. I always want to hit the ground running, so I'm always annotating from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Strategy I like with prose passages is to circle the strong verbs. And here's my rationale behind that.
Yep.
If you do that, and because verbs are action words, you know the action that's transpiring.
Yep.
And if you do that, I think that's a great way to get 25 to 50% of an understanding of what's going on in a passage. And then there's other nuances that add to that, but verbs equal action. With poetry, I'm looking for tone right away. So I want to do, just like you said, either plus or minus, this is positive, this is negative. And the further I go into a poem, further I go into a prose passage, I'm trying to hone in on that. So if I just start with the generality of this seems positive, or maybe this seems negative, I can get more specific the further along I go and the deeper I understand. So I'm not crazy about doing a ton of annotations. I want to be able to get just the right amount, like the gist of something without going bananas.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And that's actually excellent advice, because my first advice for comprehension is to find the verbs and then say who or what is doing the verbs. And the reason why, folks, is because the way that language works is that meaning is created in language by saying what is doing in action, or what is. So if you can figure out what the action is, and then you say, okay, who or what is drinking right now? And the answer is Bob in the story. Good. So Bob is drinking. That's all you need to know what's going on. All of the other language just adds to that meaning. It's the subject and verb that creates meaning. So if you're reading something and you're having a hard time, find the verb and then say who or what is doing that verb. And that's the base meaning that you need to build your comprehension. Brian, I think that's excellent, excellent advice. The other advice that I give my kids for comprehension, because I'm with you, I tell my kids not to annotate extensively on their exam because we got to move quickly. It's just true. As I tell my kids that when they see transitions or any shifts, right, that seem to be pretty major, they just draw a line. And the reason why is because, first of all, most non-holistic multiple choice questions, things about like the overall tone of the piece or the universal ideas or themes, most of the multiple choice questions actually focus on where those major shifts are. So if kids have already marked a line because they noticed a shift, although they might not annotate what they think the shift is at that point, when they get to the multiple choice question that draws them right back to that line, they're going to be like, oh my word, I noticed a shift here. Good. The answer is probably the shift that you noticed. They're just articulating it for you. So my students will just read, just draw little lines where the shifts are. The other thing that my students, I tell my students to do is I tell them to read with questions in mind. So if they can break a passage into, let's say, 4 major shifts, they then ask, okay, in this section, what can I learn about a character's relationship to another character, a conflict, a future plot event, a mood, or a universal idea, which most people call theme. So my kids have those questions just running through their mind, or at least they're supposed to. That's what we practice, running through their mind. And so every single section, they're just like, okay, so what do I learn about a character here? Nothing. Okay, good. What do I learn about a character's relationship with another character here? Nothing. Okay, what do I learn about a conflict? And that's how they compute. And we just practice that. And folks, that will help you get the answers to most of your questions.
I'll add one thing to that. You know, my students in doing the multiple choice Monday sometimes have read a passage and have said, I have no idea what I just read. And that's understandable. These are passages you've never seen before. You don't have any context on them. This is your first exposure to them. But often the questions, and I think this is a great strategy, will guide you to an understanding. Because so often the questions move in chronological order of the passage. So every question is going to have evidence somewhere in the text to support it. Even if it points you to the first paragraph or the first stanza, going back and rereading it is forcing you to dive into the text again, look back at that evidence that's there, and that's going to help you understand. Now, of course, it certainly helps if you get the answer right, because that'll lead on to your progression of the next question, so on and so forth. Yeah. But if you have that moment where you freak out and you've read the first poem on the exam, you have no clue what's going on, turn to the questions. Often the questions will help you understand what the poem is trying to convey. And I think that gets to your idea of 4 major things that you'll notice in every passage on the AP exam.
I want to also just point out one other thing about multiple choice that I noticed a few years ago. And Brian, I'm not sure if you ever noticed this, but I'm going to just tell a story about it. By the way, if Marcia Hannon is watching and Marcia Hannon's students are watching, folks, Marcia is like the best. So Ms. Hannon, if you're there, please know. And if y'all have ever heard that Ms. Hannon and I are friends, we are. We even spent Christmas together this year. She invited my family down, and it was absolutely delightful. But anyway, Brian, back to multiple choice. When you talked about the answers kind of building understanding, I'm going to give an anecdotal piece of evidence. I'm going to encourage everybody to do this after we get off this live stream. But especially with poetry, but it also works with prose. But I could picture it the most with the multiple choice about the Albuquerque graveyard. So y'all want to Google search AP Lit multiple choice Albuquerque graveyard. Now, the Albuquerque graveyard is a poem about the civil rights movement and segregation. Okay. And folks, if you go and look at the multiple choice answers, every single correct answer, except for one question, ties directly to civil rights, or the civil rights movement and segregation. So if you read your multiple choice and you can pick out those single abstract ideas that the reading is about, when you narrow it down to 2 answers in your multiple choice, every time go with the answer that relates to the ideas that the piece is about. Another example of this, and Brian, if you remember the sonnet, please tell me, but there's a sonnet multiple choice that starts with, if thou will ever hate me, then hate me now. Ooh. And I cannot remember the sonnet number. forgive me. But folks, if you just Google, I wish I could say Google search it too, but you can't because I don't know the sonnet number. But sure enough, if you looked at all the correct answers, every single one is tied to the theme of the piece. You can answer almost every question. When you're stuck in AP Lit on multiple choice, pick the answer that relates to the idea that the piece is about or the ideas, and you will most likely get it right. That you can't do that in AP Lang, but you can in Lit. And I kid you not, out of 10 questions, 9 out of 10 every time relate directly to the theme.
I noticed that just this week because I was working with a student after school. We did the one multiple choice set with the North Star, which was about the celestial North Star in the sky. But then they give you the context that it's also about the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. I think this helps a lot. If they are going to take the time to give you context to a passage, that is important because they're keying you in on something essential. The same is probably true of footnotes. They're not going to footnote things that are irrelevant. They are going to footnote things that call attention maybe to specific lines or words because they may factor into multiple choice question or overall comprehension of the passage.
Absolutely. All right. So what we're going to do now, it's like 7:26. So let's actually shift to question 1 towards poetry. And let's deal with the struggles and let's deal with ways that we can fix the struggles for our kids. Oh, sorry, Brian. So what are the struggles that your kids have when I was reading comments?
Me too.
What are some of the struggles that your kids have with when approaching poetry on test day that we can hopefully give some strategies to alleviate here today?
I think 2 things that I see often. Number 1, they're only giving general evidence. They're not giving evidence on the word level. So the thing I try to encourage my students to think about is pick out snippets. Snippets mean 1 word, 2 words, at most 3 to 4 words. You don't want to quote 2 to 3 lines of the poem. In a 40-minute essay, you don't have time for that. The second thing is giving me the generalities. So they see the metaphor or they see the simile. They tell you what the simile is. They just summarize it. There's no depth of understanding. There's no complexity to it.
Okay, so super cool here. One of the easiest ways to help with similes, folks, if you write about similes or metaphors, is don't call them similes and metaphors. Actually say that the author is comparing or contrasting. And the reason why is because when you actually say that verb, that means that you recognize what that image is functioning to do. So you would say contrasts blank with blank, and then you would say in order to, and because you know that it's contrasting, you can then articulate what the qualities are that are being contrasted in the poem. So that's much better. So you might be able to say that's a simile right there, but no, is it a simile that's meant to compare, or is it a simile that's meant to contrast? Same thing with metaphor. Anything else before I toss in a couple pieces of advice here too?
I love a strong thesis. I think if you write and you've got a great formula for thesis writing, if you write a strong thesis, it's going to set you up for success later on down the road. If you write a very generic one, and here's the thing about the thesis point, it's easy to get. And I call it low-hanging fruit. If you have an original idea that you put in a sentence, most likely you are going to get the thesis point as long as it answers the question with a little degree of insight. But if you start adding complexity to that thesis statement by putting commas, conjunction like and or but, and showing that there's layers of meaning to a poem or a prose passage, I think that sets you up for more development in your body paragraphs, more layers of analysis, and that's how you get that evidence and commentary that matters so much.
Right. And actually, I'll talk about adding complexity in just a second too. Now, when it comes to approaching the poem, one of the questions that's here, it says, how can I better understand a poem? I've got trouble digging deeper. Now, with the multiple choice questions, I think the advice was best, hey, go through the answers and let them kind of work with you as you learn, as you understand the poem more as you go through multiple choice. But on the actual essay writing portion, I make my students turn the prompt into a question because most of the time it says, analyze how the poet uses poetic elements and techniques in order to convey the complex blank. So sometimes it's the complex attitude of the speaker or the complex relationship the speaker is in. And my students will always turn that into a question. What is the complex attitude of the speaker? What is the complex relationship the speaker is in? So you can turn every one of these prompts into a question. And when we talk about complexity, folks, we're just talking about layers. So when my students write thesis statements, what I make my kids do is they do, in the poem, the author, describes this, compares this, and then they'll say, in order to highlight, And then I require them to put the words that although. So they'll say, in order to highlight that although this, and that's going to be their thesis. And that's how they're going to build their complexity, because they're going to notice that although the speaker thinks this woman is a fly honey, he also realizes he's going to be in a lot of trouble if he continues to date her because he hurt her so bad. She hurt him so bad the first time. And that's like for that he looked not upon her prompt from like 2014. If you remember that. If you remember that poem, right? And so if you put the words that although in your thesis, that can help create that complexity to understand it. But for the student that asked, how do I better understand a poem, especially for poem 1, turn the prompt into a question. Find where it says the complex relationship between the speaker and the setting. Good. What is that relationship? If you can read the poem and tell me what that relationship is at the end, we're good to go. You can actually you will interpret that poem pretty well.
I think I saw the biggest jump in my class in the past 2 weeks. Shout out to Tristan Stapleton, because he definitely got this. But I did a mini lesson on complexity, and I had my students just look at what you just said there. Every AP prompt is going to use the word complex. It's going to be, like you said, a complex relationship, a complex situation, a complex memory. There's something complex about every single AP passage. That's why those passages are chosen, because there are those layers to them. Mm-hmm. So in class, I had them say, okay, if this is a complex relationship, give me one moment where it's complex. And so we had one identification. Then I forced them to find a second moment where it changes beyond that first thing. They found that. Then they had to find and push themselves to find a third moment where it changes again. Something about it is different. If you have those 3 layers, you're setting yourself up for complexity. Doesn't guarantee that you're going to get the sophistication point, but you're sure on your way to going there, as long as you write it sophisticatedly with insights and with good sentence structure.
Right. And I also tell my students too, that when we deal with complexity, they have to talk about at least 2 things, but I'm hoping for 3. Yeah. But if I have some kids that can only write 2 body paragraphs, it's just the case. And especially with literature, what that means is that when you all write, you want to pull something from evidence closer to the beginning of the story or the poem. And then in your second paragraph, you absolutely want to have something from the end of the poem. Folks, if you're writing about poetry and you're writing an essay about poetry, your last paragraph that's before your conclusion, if you're going to provide evidence and commentary, has to have something from the last 3 lines. It absolutely must, because in poetry in particular, that is where the theme is developed. And so you're going to see this contrast or this shift from the beginning to the end. So just know when you're writing your last body paragraph, whether it's your second body paragraph or your third in your essay, your evidence must come from from somewhere within the last 3 lines. Okay. I'm going to go back to the multiple choice for just 1 second, Brian, because it's a great question in here. We had talked about how the multiple choice, the questions can kind of help you understand the storyline. Mm-hmm. And someone asked, well, do they actually write a correlative false storyline for some of the lead distractors? No, they don't. Okay. So for you who asked that question, that is way too much thinking that's going on there. Not for you. I'm just saying in terms of writing wrong answers that create a false comprehension of the piece, not happening. So you can actually rest assured that if you can see the consistent thematic line through the answers, that's the right one.
All right. So one question I see in the chat is, do we need a conclusion? I think if you have the time for it, it's great. But when you're writing an essay in roughly 40 minutes on something you've never seen before, there's nothing directly in the rubric that says you need a conclusion. What you do need is a strong thesis. You need evidence and commentary that often happens in your body paragraphs. And if you can achieve that sophistication point, I know some people call it the unicorn point. Mm-hmm. I think a conclusion is a way to reach for it, but it's not essential. So if you're going to leave anything out, I think the conclusion is the one thing to leave out. And I'll make that caveat because we'll probably get to it later. I think question 3 is the one question where you do need a conclusion. I think it's essential there. But we'll get to that in a little bit.
I also tell my students that they have no business writing full intro paragraphs. Their first paragraph can just be their thesis. And the reason why as a reader is because I'm reading those papers so quickly. I need to see that you get a thesis here. You don't have a lot of time. And if you're going to spend time writing paragraphs that aren't going to get you the most amount of points, which is what evidence and commentary will do, have it be a strong conclusion. Because if you write a strong conclusion, then that's the last thing that I read. And if you have a strong thesis, that's like somebody who comes into the room and I'm like, wow, that person's awfully good looking. And then all of a sudden they come down and you write a really strong paper. And I'm like, wow, that person has awesome character, as I'm listening in at the table over next door or right next to him. And then the person comes up to me after and like writes, his or her number on a piece of paper and puts it down in front of me and then gives me a wink and says, call me. That's what a good conclusion is like. And now I'm like, crud, this person has roped me in. And we want your papers to be like that, figuratively, of course. Now, that also reminds me, someone asked here, are there any good literary elements that you can fall back on to analyze? And one of the things that I've noticed is this, and this actually comes from a student that I work with in Hong Kong. And he said that one of the wit teachers in his school said that in every poem, every year, you can always fall back on the fact that there will be a symbol in that poem. Mm-hmm. And I was like, let's go test that hypothesis. And we looked at a bunch of different prompts, every single one symbol in the poem. So folks, please note that tomorrow when you get your poem, you will most likely be able to find at least one element that is entirely symbolic of something bigger.
I always talk about the big five for my students. You can always write about tone. That's always going to be there, guaranteed. You can always write about diction. Guaranteed a poem is going to have words. Yeah. There will be syntax to it, and there may be a lack of punctuation, and that's noticeable, and that's probably something worth writing about. Or the way the punctuation is structured, whether it's like short declarative sentences, it's long complex sentences. Those are three that are going to be guaranteed to be there. You could always talk about figurative language. I think there's always been a poem with that in it. And then certainly theme. So those are my big five that no matter what, you could always fall back to those five things.
Gotcha. Now, one question is, how do we identify complexities better? And I'm going to answer that first, and then, I'll let you chime in too. I tell my kids, you want to identify complexities by knowing what you're looking for with complexities. And you look for complexities in three different ways. There are what are called layered complexities. Layered complexities are when you notice something that, let's say, is completely positive in nature, but in three different ways. Like a person can be kind, a person can be generous, and a person can be helpful. Those are all positive things. So although we have a static character who's like a good character, let's say, there's still complexity to the character, because although the character is good, there are three different ways that this character embodies that goodness. The next type of complexity is called contradictory complexity, which is the contrast. And this is what you'll most likely see on your AP exams, by the way. You'll see contrast. And this is where things start to contradict one another. So that layer of complexity shows up when you're like, oh, okay, so the person is, let's say a little bit overly mature, yet acts immaturely here. Or this person is significantly lonely in this particular setting, but now feels like there's some friendship here. Oh, now the person's lonely again. You see those kind of contrasting moments. That's where you can pick up the complexities the most, is when you see contrasts and shifts. So when you read, this is why my kids are always marking contrasts and shifts, no matter what they're reading. That's where the complexity lies, because it's, okay, here I learned this about the character, but now I learned this about the character. Or here I learned this about their relationship, but now I learned this. And that's where those layers build in. Where do they contrast, or where do they actually layer up as being entirely positive or negative? The last one is paradoxical complexity, but quite frankly, I have never seen that on an AP Lit exam, so we're not going to get into that right now.
Big thing for me is with especially question one, poetry, you're going to have what the poem says. You're going to be able to analyze that. You're going to find your devices that the poet's using. Looking at the speaker is, I think, a great way to achieve complexity, because the speaker, and here's the phrase that I've used in the class a couple times this year, what has motivated them into speech? Like, what has caused them to say this poem, write this poem? So I'll use an example to clarify what I'm talking about. We read the poem this year, Looking for the Gulf Motel, and it's all about someone driving down a road in Florida looking for a hotel that he used to go to on vacation with his family. But if you understand this speaker is 34 years old and he is nostalgic for the past in a way that leaves him scarred, because part of that poem is about his father passing away. When you realize these things, you realize the anger that he possesses for the past, the nostalgia he possesses for the past, and that comes through in the poem, but the speaker never says those things, but you understand his motivation for saying this, for composing this poem, for uttering this poem. Paying attention to the speaker adds another layer of dimension that most students overlook, and understanding their motivation of what has compelled them to say this, I think, is a great way to achieve those layers of complexity that can achieve that point that seems so elusive.
And we'll actually talk about the sophistication point in just a minute. Somebody asked if when we were talking about thesis statements, if we meant for the thesis to be bland, because we were like, hey, let's get that thesis out there. No, that is not what we meant, okay? The thesis point, what we were trying to say was that it's very easy to earn, even if it's kind of, even if the thesis is bland, you could most likely get the thesis point as long as you address the question in some way and don't just repeat it. In the chat, I actually just put a video to the only lit thesis template that you will ever need in your entire life. And I actually give examples of how to use it for question 1, question 2, and question 3 in that video. It is not bland at all. It's incredibly complex, but it's also something that you can just easily implement super simply. And also it says, so our thesis statement, another question was, so can our thesis statement have a question in it? Or does it have to be a firm answer? And you want your thesis to be a firm claim about your understanding. That's for sure. Okay. Somebody asked about where the phrase "that although" should be in the thesis statement. And it can show up anywhere after the words "in order to." So when you write your thesis, the author does A, B, and C in order to, you could say, in order to highlight that although, and then put your complexity. Sometimes I have students, my thesis statement has 3 movements. The authors do this for this reason, and it illustrates this universal insight. Sometimes I have students that say the author does A, B, and C in order to highlight this about the characters or the relationships or whatever the question is asking. And then they'll illustrate, then they'll say ultimately illustrating that although this universal truth is here, there's another universal truth. So you can put it in one of 2 spots. I do have videos about that. For those of you that really want to cram, if you go to the Garden of English YouTube channel and look up that although or adding complexity to your thesis, I have a video that covers how to do that with rhetorical analysis and Lang and also AP Lit. Okay. Sorry for talking so much about that one there, Brian.
No, that's good.
All right. Anything good in the chat here that you're like, hey, we got to address this right here?
Especially for question 1, poetry.
Let's see. All right. We talked about, all right, here we go. What about understanding the archaic poem? Any tips for the archaic poem? I will say this, Brian, I haven't seen as many archaic poems as I used to on the most recent exams. That doesn't mean they ain't going to show up. I'm going to just toss that out there, but I've seen a lot more contemporary poetry.
So I think we're talking about literature on the exam that's going to cover from the Renaissance to the modern period. So that's a huge chunk of time, and there's no way to predict what you're going to see. So the past few years, it feels like the poems have been more modern, like The Myth of Music, Richard Blanco's Shaving. So I don't know if we're due for an older poem. I don't know if there's any way to guess that. And I think you probably drive yourself nuts at this point trying to figure that out. But we're not going to see the old English that's all the like Canterbury Tale style of language.
Yeah.
But one of the things that will be helpful is you'll often get some type of setup in the prompt itself, a little bit of context that should guide your reading. So if you're struggling with the passage, go back to that prompt. They're going to force you to focus on something specific about that poem. Whether, like we said, it's a complex relationship, complex situation, complex memory, whatever it is, like the landlady is another example. And you just have to focus on that and find your evidence for that. I think if you find your evidence first, kind of have it jotted down on your scrap paper in front of you, then you could piece that together and come up with a thesis. And to go back to that thesis point, weak thesis equals often weak essay. That's, I'd say, 90% of the time true. Strong thesis often equals strong essay. And not always, but I would say 60 to 70% of the time that's true. And the way to have a strong thesis, have some insight, have some layers. You keep that in the back of your mind tomorrow, you're going to be in good shape.
Yeah. And once again, I did drop the thesis video in the chat. Somebody asked if we could actually practice writing thesis statements. We don't have time right now. Unfortunately, I'd love to do that, but the videos are there for you folks. I don't know if you know this, but I have playlists for AP Lit where I go from how to break down a prompt on test day to let it let you focus on exactly what you need to read for, all the way to finding evidence, to producing thesis statements, to producing topic sentences, all with templates. I can template your commentary so that you can know that your commentary is being developed and whatnot. Also, somebody actually tossed in here that it would be awesome if you like this video and press subscribe. And that is true, folks. That actually helps me out a ton, and it helps get this content out to other people who need that. B, yeah, we did talk about multiple choice. Just real quick, Brian, before we move on to question 2, which we'll do in just a moment. And I think that a lot of tips that we said for question 1 actually work with question 2. But do you have any tips for test anxiety? Like if you have that one student who's like, I just got my exam tomorrow, like what's going to happen? Test anxiety tips. Do you got anything?
I feel like in my class, I've tried to build some confidence over the past 2 weeks. And one of the things I'm trying to get my students to do is we're reading independently right now. I'm giving them autonomy to write about their books on their blogs. I think we're at the point in the year where like you should be confident in yourself as a reader. If you've shown up to class almost every single day, you've done analytical work almost every single day, I think you're going to come into this test from a place of confidence, knowing that you put in the work. I think, let's be honest, the hard thing about this test, it is challenging to study for because you don't know what passages you're going to see. It's not like, let's say, math where you have to memorize formulas, or there's not a lot of facts on this test. They're not even asking questions about the identification of literary elements as much as they used to.
Yeah.
It's more about how those elements operate within a passage.
Yep.
So knowing like a core 10 to 12 poetic elements, prose elements, I think if you have that in your back pocket going into the test, knowing that diction is not just word choice, but the fact that a poet chose that word at that moment reveals something about what they're trying to create in terms of an effect. So if you see a word that stands out to you, try to determine what it's doing. What effect is it creating on you as a reader? There's a lot you can write about, even if you don't know everything about the poem. And some of the simplest things are the most obvious, like diction, like syntax, like tone. And sometimes tone can be general because it's a good starting point to say it is negative at this moment, but then it shifts to something slightly more positive in line, and you cite the line. And I think if you start from those places of confidence and try to build from there, it's amazing how many students as an AP reader work their way to a strong thesis by the end of the essay because they're writing and they're understanding the poem as they're writing it. So as they're writing their essay, they're coming to a deeper understanding of what they're processing. I think that's where this test rewards the fact that the thesis can exist anywhere in the essay. And you're graded on the strength of your analysis. So you don't have to be perfect from the beginning. You can write a really good essay as you go, and that's going to get you an upper level score.
Yeah. For me, when it comes to test anxiety, is I always tell kids, look at, you're not stupid. You're not. And a lot of times kids are like, but I feel like it. No, stop. You know how to read and you can do this. And I know that because I've watched kids do it successfully that had no business being in an AP classroom. And I don't mean that I actually have kids that have had no business. I love having whomever in my classroom. It doesn't matter to me who they put in there. So because of that, I just want people to realize, go in with confidence. That will help with your test anxiety. You've been preparing for this all year. Okay. And so that's what I tell my students all the time. Like, you have to take the test. And also, if you're nervous, that's a good thing because that actually means that you care. If you weren't nervous, that's when it's like, hey, can we try to see if we're invested in this or not? And so just think about those things and just power through. Folks, this is part of life and being human. Having those nerves and saying, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to anyway, that is what is so laudable about this task. And you can do it, and you can do it well. And I know that you can. And if you need some strategies to fall back on, that one that Brian mentioned earlier about circling verbs in whatever you're reading, that is a perfect strategy to help lower your test anxiety. Because if you can figure out the verbs and then who or what is doing the verbs, you will be able to comprehend what you need to power through, guaranteed. Brian, I'm going to answer a quick question about conclusions very generally, and then we can shift over to questions 2 and 3, okay?
Sounds good.
All right. So I'm getting questions about conclusions that say, should we simplify the conclusion or should we make them complex? And the truth is, folks, what you want to do with a conclusion to make it so that they don't just summarize your paper, I'm going to tell you what to do in 2 sentences, and it works great every time, okay? You want to extend your understanding of the universal insight. So I'm going to give you 3 steps for writing a conclusion. And like I said, it can be a 2 to 3 sentence conclusion, and it will work every time. When you get to your conclusion, if you have time to write one, the first thing you need to make a choice about is this. When my reader finishes reading my paper, do I want them to have a positive experience or a negative one? Now, no matter what, you can't go wrong with this because human beings love positivity. So that's a good thing. However, things that are negative actually are more impactful later. So because of that, you have a good choice here of, do I want to be positive here or negative? Now, even if you have a negative kind of passage, you can then spin that to the positive pretty easily. So what do? First, do I want to have my reader have a negative or positive experience? The next thing that you're going to do is this. Your first sentence is going to make a thematic insight claim. And what that means here is this. I tell my students, you can say throughout the piece, whatever it might be, and this works for all 3 essays, throughout the piece, whatever it might be, and then we put the author's name, we'll say the author presents, and they'll put a thematic statement. Then the very next sentence will start with, in a world where, and my kids will make an observation that relates to that universal statement. They'll say, in a world where this happens, and then they'll finish that sentence, and they'll say, in a world where this is going on, this is the outcome that we're pushing for. And that last little snippet right there is that what I call Cinderella's glass slipper. And it's that little something that you're leaving around that's an insight that I'm just like, wow, this kid totally hit me with that. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. I had a student write about a raisin in the sun earlier today, and she decided that she wanted to have a positive ending. Here's her 2-sentence conclusion. In A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry presents the youngers receiving a large sum of money. Oh, sorry, that's the thesis. My bad. My bad. The conclusion. Throughout the piece, Hansberry projects that losing family is significantly worse than losing money. In a world where individuals seek more materialism and money to buy things that they don't need, it's important to prioritize one's family since they are irreplaceable and will still be around once the money is gone. Boom. My student decided that she wanted to have a nice positive ending, 2 sentences, and here are the core words that she used. Sentence 1, she starts with throughout the piece. She put the author's last name, then she says projects. Sentence 2, it starts with in a world where individuals, and then she makes a claim, and then she finishes it up with something positive. That brings complexity to the issue, and then it also projects it to something more. So just a little comment on the conclusion there. All right. Sorry about that, Brian. Sorry for my soapbox. I saw the conclusion question and I was like, we can fix this in 2 seconds.
No problem.
Okay. Let's actually shift to question 3, only because question 2 can be addressed the exact same way that question 1 can.
Okay.
So one question that came up about question 3 is, what if you're kind of a little shaky on the details of the book that you're trying to recall for question 3? What can you do to fix that, especially the night before the exam?
So the thing I had my students do over the past couple of weeks is review sheets that we did at the end of every major work that we read. I call it 6 scenes to themes, where Pride and Prejudice, they had to pick out these 6 most important moments or scenes in that novel, write about what happens with some insight, and then connect it to major themes in that novel. So if I were a student and I'm shaky about The Great Gatsby or unsure about Frankenstein, write down your 6 themes or scenes that you think are important. I would go to SparkNotes tonight, Schmoop, any one of those websites, and write about those moments and how those moments are significant to the work as a whole. That's the key thing that I think students often forget on question 3. They'll write about a house because that was one of the previous questions, or this search for justice. That's another previous question. They never make that connection from that specific element of the prompt to the meaning of the work as a whole. And I always explain question 3 as it's always the small thing that you have to connect to the really big thing. And if you don't make that connection, you only write about the house or the search for justice, then you're missing half of that question. So making strong thematic connections is really important.
All right. And actually, just so you know, for question 3, I know that you had mentioned that, the conclusions are important, and I'm willing to bet that it's because you tie that into thematic, ventures. I just put a video in the chat, folks, that talks about how you can easily identify theme in any story. So you can write some thematic statements tonight if you're trying to plan for your exam. What I completely agree with everything Brian said. Get on SparkNotes tonight and remind yourself about the books that you have read. Now, Brian, do you have like 2 to 3 go-to books that you're like, my students need to have these in their back pocket to write about?
So we did this in class. One of the major works we read was Pride and Prejudice. We read Mudbound. We went through, I think, 15 years of Q3 prompts and saw that those 2 novels could work for 90% of the questions. There's 1 or 2 where it feels like you're shoehorning the book into that prompt. But I think if you have 3 books that you know well, or 3 major works, I should say, because it's not just books, it's plays as well, you're going to be in good shape. And knowing well means, not just character names, important moments, important themes, major issues within that work. And usually it's conflict-based or it's thematic-based. But finding those 3 that you have in your back pocket, I think you're going to come into this test from a position of strength.
Yeah. Absolutely. The key ones that I tell my kids to have in their back pockets are Of Mice and Men, Macbeth, and Frankenstein. We also do Jekyll and Hyde as a longer work, and sometimes we can work in Alice in Wonderland as well. But I've only ever seen 1 prompt that Macbeth couldn't answer, actually. 1. And then I've only seen 1 prompt that Jekyll and Hyde couldn't answer, too. but everybody's done different things. Someone said Crime and Punishment. Absolutely. Lord of the Flies. Now, folks, please remember, you can write about any book at all. Okay. You can write about any book or play that you know of. In fact, you can even get away with a couple other things too that I don't recommend. So I'm not even going to say them out loud on this piece. But someone did mention that someone wrote about Ratatouille and got a 5. I can neither confirm nor deny. Okay. But I do want to point out, some people have been asking about avoiding plot summary in question 3. And I just want to point out that I put a video in the chat about how to produce commentary for lit, where there are templates that will work for all 3 essays for your commentary to make sure that you have it. However, Brian, why don't you answer that question for us first? How do we avoid the plot summary in writing our question 3? I'll also give some tips, and that's when we're going to wrap it up for tonight. We'll probably go to about 8:05, 8:10 if you're okay with that.
Right. Yeah, it's great. Question 3, I've read at the AP reading for years. So works that stand out every year. Students are writing about Hamlet. They're writing about Frankenstein. They're writing about The Great Gatsby. Those are the 3 ones you see every single year in large numbers. Doesn't mean that those are the best choices. It's what you know well. And I think that's the key here is don't just choose The Great Gatsby because you read it in 10th grade and you think it'll work. Choose the book that you know best and you can best answer the question with. To do that, that's the key there. You have to answer the question. So your job on question 3 is not to tell the reader everything about the book. And I think that's where often young adult literature is a bad choice for question 3, because people want to show how much of a fan they are of Harry Potter or the Hunger Games or whatever. And they tell you everything about the entire series and not just that specific prompt. So focusing on the prompt and being analytical. Part of analysis is looking at the parts and showing how they connect to a bigger whole. So if you focus on the parts and tell me your insight about them. So insight is demonstrating a deep understanding. If you show you have a deep understanding and not just factual details, but what it reveals about a character or about a moment, that is not plot summary. That's analysis. So digging deeper. I did like these gestures all the time in class where I was like getting them to dig down and find the deeper meaning behind something. That is how you avoid plot summary, is not telling me everything about the book, but really digging down on what the question is asking you to do.
Now, when we finish up, Brian, we cannot sign off without answering the one biggest mistake that we see over and over. Okay, so we have to remember that we have to answer that. But I'm going to address this plot summary part 2. I should say as well. When my students write a paragraph for me, they know that they have to produce a topic sentence, and their topic sentence always has to have what the author's producing and why the author produces it in the piece. Okay, so we might have Robert Louis Stevenson begins by describing a decrepit door in order to symbolize the horrible character of Edward Hyde. So that's their topic sentence. When my kids now describe that decrepit door next, they have to do a minimum of 3 sentences of describing how it shows up in the story, but a maximum of 5. So my students now know they have to be detailed enough, because this is one of the things I see the most. When kids produce essays for question 3 that only have 1 sentence of evidence, it's never detailed enough. But when they go more than 5 sentences, you're right. It's too much plot summary because we just have super fans. Mm-hmm. And so my kids know once they hit sentence 5, no matter what, they're done with describing the evidence. Mm-hmm. And then they move to commentary. My students are required to have at least 3 sentences of commentary every time, and they have to follow this pattern. The first sentence has to have the word because in it. The second sentence has to start with the phrase consequently since. And the third sentence has to start with the word thus, and it also has to have the phrase due to the fact that in it. And with those elements, you are guaranteed to actually produce commentary. So now I've got a thesis, 3 sentences of detailed evidence, and 3 sentences of commentary. I've got a minimum of a 7-sentence paragraph that's going to most likely be detailed. So that's kind of where that is. 2 paragraphs is fine, by the way. And you also don't have to pick from the books on the list. People are asking, listen, I tell my students they're not allowed to write about Twilight or the Hunger Games, but that doesn't mean that you can't write about Twilight and the Hunger Games. Last year's hierarchy prompt, the Hunger Games actually worked quite well for that. I still would have been mortified if my kids wrote about it, but there's no necessarily literary merit. I had a student a few weeks ago write about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it was incredible. I mean, the essay was incredible. My son read that in 4th grade, but it was great, and it answered the prompt, and I was like, Ellie, this this piece is awesome. So, write about what you can write about well, because you know it a lot.
Every day at the AP reading, when these essays are graded in June, I read question 3 for a few years. Every day we are reminded to grade the essay based on the strength of its analysis, not the work chosen. So pick the book that you know best, pick the book that you can analyze best, and write the best analysis that you can. You do that, you'll be rewarded for it. And that is another AP reading mantra: reward the students for what they do well. So for everyone that's out there, we are encouraged to realize that this is a first draft written in 40 minutes. It is not a polished product. So I know there were questions earlier about spelling. As long as spelling is not distracting us from understanding and comprehending what you're trying to say, that's going to be a non-issue. Focus on what you know well, focus on what you know best, and you will be rewarded for your strengths.
Yeah. And all right. So now that we're going to finish up, because we're going to send people over to Marco. Okay. So Marco Learning's link is right in the bottom there, folks. You can go to YouTube and just search Marco Learning. Let's talk about what you think is the biggest error that you see recurring. I'll finish up with what I think is the biggest error, and then we'll go our own way. Just, I should say we'll Fleetwood Mac it and go our own way. But here we go. What do you have there, Brian?
Biggest error is time management on the essays. You're writing 3 essays in 2 hours, so that's 40 minutes per essay. I've seen at the AP reading great essays early on in a booklet, and then that 3rd essay falls short, and you realize that student who was writing brilliantly just ran out of time. So just manage that time wisely. So if you have 2 hours, keep in mind your 40-minute markers along the way. Kind of write that down on the top of the essay booklet as you start the second portion of the exam, because you want to make sure you maximize your score across 3 essays. You don't want to have 2 high essays and 1 low. So managing your time is probably my best advice.
Okay. The biggest issue that I see, and that I have seen in the past when it comes to writing all 3 essays, is that is that a lot of times students don't project the why. So as they're writing, they'll say the author begins by using a simile here, period. And then the kids will put the evidence in, and then they'll say, and this shows the complexity of the author's attitude towards this particular scene. That is not an analysis. That is not commentary. What you need to do, folks, is whenever you write about something that a speaker or an author does, you want to say the author begins by, and we'll just say, describing a dark tropical night. And then you're going to say, which highlights, and you're going to put the why there, which highlights the ominous mood that's being created. That is a much better topic sentence, and that will help you create the paragraph. Because now, where's the evidence that there's a dark tropical night? Put that in your paragraph and explain how that creates an ominous mood. There's your paragraph. So it's that why that I see that's missing so much, that keeps kids at a 1-2-0 as opposed to even a 1-3-0. The other thing that I see a lot is that in commentary, folks, you guys can know if you're producing commentary if you see words like because, consequently, since, so that, and due to. Those 5 words and phrases, if those are in your paragraphs, you are producing commentary. If they're not in your paragraphs, you're not. And so those are the biggest things that I see over and over and over again, where I'm just like, oh, if this kid just put a Y right here, that would allow there to be so much more direction. All right, Brian, final words before we shut this down.
You can write the essays in any order you want, so there's no definitive way to answer them. Play to your strengths. I tell my students probably to start with question 3, because that's the one they can come in most prepared for, having, like I said, 2 to 3 works in their back pocket that they know well. But if poetry's your thing, start there. If prose is your thing, start there. Just play to your strengths.
Absolutely. And I'm going to just say, go in there with confidence tomorrow. Y'all have been planning for this for a long time. You're going to be okay. And if you have nerves, don't be scared. You're a human being. Embrace the humanity of the moment and go own it. And when you guys all do own it, come back and tell us how it went in the comments of this particular video. On top of that, one last piece of advice. When you get your score back in the summer, if it's not the score that you're looking for, even if it is the score you were looking for, your test is a 3-hour moment of your entire life. Your identity is not a number. Your identity is not an outcome. So if you're like, I got a 2 or I got a 1, I'm a failure, that's nonsense. The fact that you stayed in the course, The fact that you sat for the test should give you the confidence that you need, because here's the truth. Even if you score a 1 on your AP exam, students who just sit for a test because they've taken an AP class, any AP class at all, are 80 to 90% more likely to finish college within 4 years than students who have not. So even if you don't get your qualifying score, you have put yourself in a position to be significantly more successful. I appreciate every single one of you. Apparently, Karen Silva is the best English teacher ever, although I think Brian's in tight competition for that. And I hope that you all just go own it tomorrow.
And this has been great.
Yeah, Brian, thank you very much for being my dance partner here tonight. And maybe next year we'll join up again. How does that sound?
Sounds great, man. I love it.